Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Richard Wiseman, who is a professor of the public understanding of psychology. I think I got that right.
You got that right. That's what I've been for a very, very long time. I think, my goodness, about 20 years now. Yeah.
And you're at the University of Hertfordshire. I got to make sure I get that one right.
Very good. Very good. Yes, that's right. Yeah, about 30 miles north of London is University of Hertfordshire. And that's the only job I've ever had. I did my PhD up at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, and then got the job at Herts when I was, I guess, about 25. And that's it. That's where I've been for my whole career.
And in addition to teaching, of course, you are a prolific writer. And the books that you write are ones that I think are all accessible to the general public. I mean, this latest one is called Shoot for the Moon, How the Moon Landings Taught Us the 8 Secrets of Success. You've got a book on luck called The Luck Factor, which I don't have with me.
Yeah, that's my very first one. Yes. Yeah.
And I think that's one that people keep asking you.
I'm rather weird. I'm happy we're not going to talk about luck because I've had 20-something years of talking about luck, so I'm lucked out on that. So yeah, I did luck first of all, and then moved on to some of the other ones which you're kind enough to be holding on to at the moment.
Well, this is the first. I think this is the first one I got. It's called Quirkology: How We Discover the Big Truths in Small Things. Got this one, the As If Principle, the radically new approach to changing your life. This one, 59 seconds, which, you obviously takes more than 59 seconds to read it. So
yes, it took 3 months to write. So that's
really?
Right. That was the big breakthrough book, actually, rather than the luck one. That was the one that really went all over the world. So kind of exciting.
Well, I think the title of your professorship could be the professor of the usefulness of psychology, right? Not just the understanding, because almost everything that you write about is essentially about how to take academic psychology and make it useful, right? So, academics are usually in the business of trying to understand the world, not necessarily trying to change or impact the world. So, I know when I talk to my academic psychology friends, a lot of them are just like, isn't that cool? Isn't that neat? Right. But at the end of the day, I think what most people in the public are interested in is, how do you put these insights to use? And I think that's really where you get super excited. It's like how to improve human lives through the use of this academic research.
Yeah, I mean, that's an astute observation. And, certainly in the UK, we are funded by taxpayers' money. And so it's quite reasonable for taxpayers to turn around and go, sorry, what are you doing? And in psychology, if the answer is, well, nothing that impacts on your life, then they might go, well, what's that about then? So, yeah, it's very much an applied approach. It's also an empirical approach. So it's about taking the stuff which is in scientific journals, which I hope has a fairly good scientific footing, and going, what's the implications of that? How do you move that into someone's life? And when you do that, you realize you have to capture their attention. You have to have they're being faced with messaging now more than ever. So you have to be able to capture that attention and deliver stuff that people find helpful, hopefully in an interesting way. So it's very much about that applied aspect. And I think good science should be, and certainly good psychology should be.
Well, I mean, there's a huge demand for this type of insight. And I think there's a huge industry around producing advice for people. And sometimes that advice isn't really very good. I mean, it's not grounded in academic research. And so I think part of your job is to kind of distinguish the wheat from the chaff, right? So I think it was in the 59 Seconds book, you start off by saying that there is a lot of literature out there offering quick fixes, right, to various problems that you might be encountering. And then there's a whole nother industry out there that provides people with these very, very complicated, time-consuming exercises. But, in that case, they're also not very effective. And so you're trying to offer, I think, some quick wins, but those quick wins are also based in research.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. When I started doing this, people could just go to a bookstore and buy anything at all. There's no regulation on it. It'd be like going to a pharmacy and saying, I've got a bad back, and they go, try these ones. You go, is there any scientific evidence backing it up? They go, no, just try those pills and see how it goes. it would be crazy. But that's the situation in psychology. Pretty much anyone can write anything. And some of that stuff will have no impact. And the problem with that is it might force people to be rather fatalistic. They go, well, I've tried all these complicated procedures and nothing works, and therefore I can't do anything to change my life. And we know that's a very damaging belief to have. Other times, there may actually be downsides. I mean, this idea of imagining your perfect self, imagining your perfect future, imagining your perfect career, quite a lot of research to show that actually decreases the chances of that stuff happening in the future. So it really was digging into the psychological literature and going, what does work, and how do we then make that attractive for people? And so early on, and now this is much better known, when 59 Seconds was very early on in all of this, the idea of having a gratitude journal of the end of each day, just jotting down 3 or 4 things which have a sense of gratitude in your life to overcome the problem of habituation, where these sort of good things vanish from our lives, is very, very effective. It's very effective at lifting mood and generally changing how we see ourselves in a positive way. And everyone should know that. It pains me that we don't teach this stuff in schools. We teach kids all sorts of things they'll never learn, they'll never use again in their lives, but we don't teach them solid, useful, positive psychology. I think there really is a massive kind of opportunity, potential there to really change people's lives. And for me, it's astonishing. I go out and give talks, and people come up afterwards and say, I read 59 or whatever it is, and it changed everything for me. And that is an astonishing moment to think that what you've done has impacted in a positive way on people. And what greater honor is there really in science than that, certainly within psychology. And it's I've been doing it a long time, and it's still an amazing feeling when people say that.
But I mean, when it comes to things like pharmaceuticals, right, we have the FDA that will, require some clinical trials on these drugs. And then we have like the food additive industry, or the supplement industry, which is completely like the Wild West. And you can pitch, the magic green pills, and no one's going to stop you, right?
Yes.
But there is no real clear-cut divide, I think, in the world of psychology advice, right? Where you can say, oh yeah, this thing's been clinically approved by the FDA, right?
That's right.
I mean, so how do people, if they're interested in consuming these insights, like how do they? I mean, do people have the capacity to evaluate the kind of advice that they're getting? I mean, I have my own methods. I'm always like running to Science and Nature. I'm always looking at to see if there has been some experiments, and if those experiments have been well run. And that's my job. Like that's what I do by day. So, for the ordinary person, are they just like, well, this guy Wiseman's got PhD after his name, so it's got to be good stuff.
It's difficult. I mean, self-help books, self-development books, they are the kind of pack animals of publishing. You go into someone's house, they never just have one on their shelf. They'll have a whole load of them, which is the first clue that maybe that first one wasn't as effective as they'd hoped. So I think they're reasonably sophisticated consumers. I do think they go with who's writing the book, are they well qualified, and so on. And nowadays, I think there is an understanding about things being peer reviewed and appearing in scientific journals. It's why we've got to hold on to that as a kind of gold standard. It's really, really important. And much of my early work, my actual research, as it were, was on paranormal stuff. People going to psychics and mediums and astrologers. And there is no evidence at all, no reliable evidence that these people can do the things they're claiming. But for hundreds, if not thousands of years, these have been very, very popular beliefs that stood the test of time. So I don't think we're going to make a big dent in that need to believe. It's driven by people having very real issues in their lives. If you lose a loved one, of course you understand the idea that you could get a message from that person. If you're ill and mainstream medicine is telling you there's nothing or very little they can do, of course you understand that someone's going to go to a faith healer or whatever. So I think we have to tackle it on that motivational level, which is where those books come in. They offer solutions. And that's half the battle, I think, rather than seeing it from an academic perspective, just seeing it from the person in the street who's funding your work. What do they need and want in their lives? And can science provide that? And things have got much, much better in psychology. When I was doing that early stuff, there's a handful of us doing it, but now it's academics, psychologists are much more attuned to the public use of their work.
Well, I think at the core of your work is the relationship between one's beliefs about the world and what happens subsequently in the world, or how you experience the world. And I think there's a super popular book that a lot of people have been reading in the last 10 years or so. And I forget what it's called, but it's this one where, if you just imagine that you're rich, you become rich, you imagine that you're married, you become married. And, of course, this is ridiculous at some level. But, if you go back to William James, William James had an observation that there is some element of truth in this notion of, acting yourself or willing yourself or believing yourself into a particular reality. And your book, the As If Principle, is really all about that. So, what are the possibilities and limits of this fake it till you make it approach to life?
Well, yeah, so there is this whole thing about what's called positive thinking, which bizarrely I'm not a fan of. That idea that, let's just be positive and everything will work out well.
Yeah.
Actually, most things require quite a lot of hard work. One of the questions I'm always asked, because I do quite a lot of research and all sorts of podcasts and all sorts of things, is people say, how come you've written 15 books and done all the research for that? And the answer is, I haven't taken a holiday, a vacation, for about 25 years. So the answer is, I've worked extremely hard. So,
hey, like those Apollo folks, if you like it, it's not really work, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. So I'm not a huge fan of just positive thinking. It has to be grounded in research, and sometimes it's quite nuanced. And the as if principle, which, as you say, dates back to William James, Victorian natural philosopher, is this idea that when you feel happy, you act in a certain way. You might have a spring in your step and you smile. But it is also true that to some extent, there's a kind of opposite flow, that if you put a spring in your step, force your face into a smile, you feel a bit happier. And there are limits to that, there absolutely are, but it's not a bad principle that putting behavior before thoughts and feelings is quite an effective way of changing the thoughts and feelings. And people can try it. If it doesn't work for you, it doesn't work for you. But, if you're feeling a bit down, put a spring in your step and act as if you're happy and see how you feel. And there's always going to be individual differences on all of these things. But that was the crux of the as if principle. And I basically took literature from all over psychology, whether it's to do with persuasion or motivation or happiness or whatever, and brought it together under that kind of banner. So it was a long old book to research because there was so much literature in these very different areas.
Yeah, we don't have a lot of will over our feelings and our emotions, but we do have the capacity to exert willpower over our actions, right? So
yes.
When people say, "Hey, don't worry," right? Like that doesn't really help. But if you say, act in this way, and the worry may, become alleviated, that's actually practical advice.
Yeah, and also, if you're worrying about something, it's in short-term memory, if you like, and you're going over it again and again. That's got limited capacity. So actually just doing something else, forcing people to do something else, means that worry drops away because they can no longer think of it because they've got other things to think about. So in CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, actually it's the behavioral bit, getting people to behave differently when they often don't want to because they feel very down. That's a crucial part of that and often overlooked. So yeah, the book looks at that, and it was a fun one to do because it drew on so many different areas of psychology.
Yeah, one of the observations in that book that I found I'd never heard before was that people who are paralyzed, right, they're emotionally blunted in some ways because they don't have the capacity to, physically embody certain types of feelings and emotions.
Yeah, the obvious one of that is Botox, where you're paralyzing the face. Then you don't start to feel the emotions because you can't behaviorally sort of change your face in that way. So there's all sorts of interesting quirks in the research which are explained by that principle. And so with all of my work, I try and find some unifying idea and then just see where that gets you. And what's great about that is I know a little bit about many, many areas in psychology, where in academia, what you're really encouraged to do is just take a small area and just keep on drilling down. And so you more and more about less and less. But I do think it's helpful, and I say this to all my students, to always have that broad overview where you go, oh, hold on a second, that's related to something that's over here or whatever. I think it just gives you a much broader outlook, actually. It means you can join things up. And we're not very good at doing that in academia. We tend to just really focus down. And it didn't used to be like that, turn of the last century. People were much more informed about these different areas, but specialisms have really taken over.
Yeah, I mean, how would you divide the labor? I mean, you have generalists, you have specialists, but the specialists also need some general knowledge. I mean, if we were to look at the distribution across that spectrum from generalist to specialist, I mean, are there sort of, underexploited opportunities along that spectrum?
I think there are. I mean, most of the academics and PhD students I talk to are specialists. They really know their area inside out, upside down, and you go 1 centimeter away from that and they know nothing. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's crazy. You should know why you're doing what you do, why you're doing every study, and not just in terms of gaining knowledge, but what's the public good of it? Why does anyone care why you're doing what you're doing? And also know the history of your field. I mean, in this country, I don't know about the States, but we don't really teach Freudian psychology anymore. It's completely out the window. And to me, that would be like teaching, European history without looking at the Second World War. With Freud, you don't have to believe what he said. I mean, and I don't, but you do have to know about what was said and why that was such a major cultural force. And so I do think these kind of broader issues are just really good for students, particularly PhD students, because you just need to know stuff. You need to know where ideas came from. I always urge my students to pick up old journals, like the stuff from the 40s, 30s, whatever it is. Read the original articles. Don't rely on people's interpretation of that stuff in recent textbooks, because what the person was originally saying is often a lot more interesting and often quite different to what's being represented in a textbook. So I'm just a big fan of know the history, know where you're coming from.
But that makes more sense if you think of psychology as a humanistic enterprise and not as a scientific one, right? Because, I mean, in science, if you're a physicist, no one's going to read Isaac Newton, right? I mean, they should perhaps, but realistically, when you're time constrained, you're not going to go back and read Euclid, right? But if you view it as more of a humanistic enterprise, where you're trying to figure out exactly, how do people achieve discovery, how do people reformulate ideas and so forth, then it does make sense to go back and look at the history.
And what we have now as a knowledge base in physics or anything, it didn't just magically happen. It happened because people had ideas at certain points and jettisoned some of them, and others became more popular. And I think going back and knowing what people were thinking before that sea change gives you insight into the fact that the future will be different to now. In 10 years' time, it'd be depressing if physics was identical to the way it is now. It will change. And just knowing where those ideas have come from, knowing what evidence supports them, what the original thinking was, it just makes it more interesting, I think. And certainly within psychology, the number of times when I was writing those books, I would trust a description of a study that was in a textbook. Then I went back, because I'm an academic, to the original source, and I realized it'd be like a game of telephone.
Yeah.
Those things have changed and changed and changed, and you go back, and that was not the original intention of the study, or it's somewhat different the way it's been described over time. It's fascinating. And then you realize you are part of a, human activity.
Or the foundational study has no basis, right? Like a sample size of, 5 people. Back in those days, right? They didn't really, they didn't have a lot of rigor. I mean, it seems like bad ideas, however, can persist. I mean, you talk about Freudianism. I think there's still quite a strong undercurrent of Freudian ideas. out there in the general public. Some of which have survived because there's certain intuitive appeal. I mean, one of the things that you talk about is the kind of hydraulic view of emotion, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or the law of emotional thermodynamics. I don't know what you would call it, but the idea that, if you are angry, then, the way to alleviate the pressure of all that anger buildup is to kind of let it out, right? And
that's the Freudian. That's the cathartic idea.
People, yes. I think a lot of people still subscribe to that, even though, as you point out, that idea is actually probably not a good one.
Yeah, it's not supported by very much evidence. You act like an angry person, you become even angrier, basically. I mean, what Freud is amazing on is the unconscious, and the idea there's a lot going on under a kind of conscious activity that we're not aware of that then influences our decisions. That's a very modern idea in a sense. But a lot of his stuff is questionable, should we say, of its time, I believe is the kind analysis. But still not to know it, to me, seems crazy, because, out of Freud came all of modern day psychology, sometimes as a reaction against Freud, but you still have to know where it came from. It came from people's heads who were having ideas, and it's going to be the same in physics and so on. The modern day ideas we have came from people's heads, and new ideas will come from other people's heads. And so I just think it makes everything more interesting to read that old stuff. Perhaps not as far back as Newton, which would be heavy lifting if you're trying to read that. But there must be classic experiments where reading those original papers could be quite uplifting, Now, hold on.
You're not going back and reading those papers about the guy dropping the brass ball, right? That kind of stuff. I mean, that sounded pretty boring.
That's boring. But there are some great studies out there. So I'm a fan of saying to students that don't always trust textbook sources because those textbooks are sometimes written in a hurry and they're relying on other textbooks. So I think that makes life a bit more interesting. And always just asking yourself, why am I doing this? And if the answer is to get a journal publication or to get a grant, they're not the best why answers. The best why answers are because it will make the world a better place. And they're the ones that I think make people very passionate and energetic.
Well, in the book Quirkology, you talk a lot about these kind of self-fulfilling beliefs, right? So beliefs about one's luck or, beliefs about, days that you should be doing stuff and days that you shouldn't be doing stuff. And, I remember those studies that showed that people could actually will themselves to stay alive a bit longer or to die a bit earlier.
Yes.
The only way that you would actually be able to identify that is to have some pretty good data, right?
Yeah.
And so, we can now run these fairly large studies, and you've done a bunch of these studies, right? Where you've solicited input from relatively large groups of people through newspaper announcements or going to, various conferences and so forth. And so we can actually tease out the extent to which these superstitions become self-fulfilling.
That's right. We specialised in doing quite some mass participation studies for quite a number of years, including finding the world's funniest joke was one of ours, which again came out. We did that in, I think, 2000, and it's been huge. It's the last year. Everyone's writing to me because it's appeared somewhere on a website or something. Quirkology came about.
Wait, did you get an Ig Nobel for that? I mean, that seems like one of those.
No, I demand one. I demand one. I never got one, but Mark does a wonderful job with the Ig Nobels. Quirkology came about because psychology kind of broke my heart a bit. People are astonishing when you think of your friends and partners and family. They're amazing. They're complex and they're fun to talk about, or they experience emotions. They behave differently in crowds. They do things that surprise you. They do things that disappoint you, and so on. And that kind of buzzy energy of humanity, which was the reason I got into psychology, really kind of, I just love it. And then I'd open a psychology journal and I just saw this dusty old paper which had reduced that buzzing humanity to a number that wasn't very interesting. And I thought there must be some interesting psychology out there. There has to be. And that was the path into Quirkology, where it was all the quirky psychology that I love, some of which, I've carried out myself. So whether it's the impact of, the season you're born on your personality, of which there are very small theoretical effects there, or how to detect whether someone's lying to you, why people are sometimes very kind to others and why they're sometimes very cruel. Just anything quirky and unusual, that's what went into that book. But it was born of, we've lost the plot in psychology. People are amazing. We are reducing them to some very, very dull numbers. And that was the attempt to set the record straight.
Now, it's hard to really understand the kind of functionality of some of these things, right? So I'm very interested in trying to figure out, like, why did some of these things persist? And I think you're interested in that as well, right? That some of these superstitions. I mean, we're not subjecting these things to any kind of testing, right? No. We're not really thinking like Bayesians in the sense that, we would presumably behave if we were interested in maximizing our reproductive success. So, why is it that we, have these bizarre beliefs, and why do they persist?
Because we're human, because we're not naturally scientists. So, we like the idea of having some kind of control over our lives, which is completely understandable.
So we're all like those Trobriander Islanders, right? That Malinowski talks about.
Yes. So we want that sense of control. We don't like the idea of uncertainty because that means we don't know what's going to happen, and that causes us a lot of angst. And so we carry out procedures that we've been told or shown that will bring that control. We touch wood, we cross our fingers, whatever it is. Now, you're never going to test that as a scientist. You're never going to go, hold on a second, I'm going to go to the casino sometimes with my lucky charm and sometimes not, because that's not how people think. What they think is, I feel better when I go to the casino with my lucky charm. I'm more optimistic about the future. So we're not natural scientists in that sense. We're doing things that make us feel better normally about ourselves. The problem is we don't really know from a common sense perspective what actually helps us. And psychology should fill that gap of saying, actually, these are the things that are good for you, these are the things not so much. But most of the certainly superstitious stuff is driven by that sense of needing control.
Now, in your latest book, the one on the space mission, right, getting people to the moon, this is really an amazing story. I mean, you dig into these people and you describe them as mostly ordinary people, right, with ordinary backgrounds, and yet they were incredibly successful working as a team. And I know some people that work at SpaceX, and it seems like a very similar environment. I mean, these people are all relatively young, sometimes straight out of college, and they're given enormous responsibilities. And I think if you didn't know that this was about the space mission, you might think, oh, this is like a startup, except it's like this massive startup. And so when you look at the features and characteristics, and you walk through these 8 secrets of success, to what extent is this, selection, and to what extent is it treatment? I mean, was NASA really good at identifying people who had these characteristics, or did they create an environment and a milieu which was really sort of sculpting and crafting these characteristics that people had?
I think the answer is probably both. That book came about because I was talking to a friend of mine who actually bizarrely is staying with me in a minute. So he's in the room next door, comedian Helen Keane. And I was talking to Helen, and Helen loves Apollo and space stuff. And it was around just before the anniversary of the moon landings. And we're doing the whole discussion about technology and the technology that have come from the moon landings. And I just came up with this question. I just said, has anyone looked at the psychology of how we achieve this amazing thing? And she said, probably not. But I should talk to her friend, Craig. And Craig is another huge Apollo fan who's befriended the mission controllers. And it was from Craig that I managed to spend time talking to the mission controllers, particularly those involved in Apollo 11. And it honestly, it was utterly amazing. they're now in late 70s, early 80s. But when, in terms of age, when I spoke to them, they started off sounding like older people. Midway through that interview, they were back in their 20s. They were back in that control room trying to do this incredible thing that everyone had told them that was impossible. So that was great. You still saw that passion. And so I think what was happening was mainly Chris Kraft was molding all of this at the time, was he realized you need a certain type of person and you need to treat them in a certain way. And in terms of that certain type of person, you needed somebody who was really, really passionate. They all cared about getting to the moon, mainly because it was an incredible technological achievement, actually. And the other thing was that they, and it, as Jerry Bostic said, they were so young, they didn't know it couldn't be done.
Right.
They were incredible optimists. And they of course were driven on by JFK with this unbelievable sort of vision. And, they all said to me, you had this charismatic president who told you this thing was going to be done by the end of the decade. So you just got on and did it. And the more senior rocket scientists and so on were going, well, this is, going to be pretty tough, if not impossible, possibly giving up before they started. And this young group came in and went, well, we're just going to keep on going and do it. So I think they were certainly a certain type of person. But then, and it's hard to imagine this happening nowadays. I mean, they were when that started, they were in their early 20s, even when the average age was about 28, I think, when Apollo 11 and Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the moon. So that they started off in their early 20s. They were basically given the responsibility of delivering this for the country. And they were the sort of pinnacle of 400,000 people working on this, vast amounts of money, but they were just given the responsibility and told to get on with it. And they were very open about mistakes. I can remember one of them saying the quickest way of getting yourself fired from that program was to try and cover up a mistake. That the only people they wanted in that room were the people that went, you know what, I just made a mistake, because they could learn from that. So I think that was key to it. Plus, boy, did they simulate everything. They really were prepared for pretty much every single problem, which today we'd call defensive pessimism. So it's not expecting the future to go badly. It's thinking about what might happen in terms of negative outcomes in order to prepare for it. And of course, famously, the very last simulation they did, the computer going wrong, was the thing that actually happened on the actual journey down to the lunar surface. So, yeah, it was phenomenal. It was phenomenal. That doesn't pull very much on experimental psychology, actually. It pulls mainly on chatting to an amazing group of people that created history.
Yeah, I mean, does it make sense to talk about the psychology of an organization at some level? I mean, the culture of an organization. Does that make sense? Can we talk about that?
I think it does. I think it does, because this was an organization that was given a pretty much impossible task and had some very open-minded ideas about how to accomplish that. You would think you'd get your most senior rocket scientists together and you'd monitor them very, very closely, and you make certain there's a very big management structure in place and all of these things, and they kind of didn't do it. They just got on with it, gave it to a bunch of passionate people and went, what resources do you need? And they also understood, well, first of all, risk. I mean, they obviously lost some astronauts along the way. And when I spoke to the mission controllers, because I'm talking to the ones that, after the Apollo 1 fire, when 3 of the astronauts died, I'm talking to the ones that came back into the room. Yeah. Many of them didn't. Many of them said, that's it, I'm out. The ones I'm talking to, the ones that remained there, said when that tragedy happened, they thought that won't be in vain. To walk away from it means we've failed. We're going to make certain that those deaths, we learned something from it, and we're going to try and be triumphant to kind of mark that in an appropriate way. So that's part of it. And they learn how to overcome fear. I spoke to Glenn Lunny, who's no longer with us, unfortunately, but he was saying, somebody at some point has to press the button on the Saturn V rocket. And launched that thing. And he said, it's terrifying. And everybody, every committee, nobody wants to take responsibility for that. Everybody want to go, it's somebody else's thing. So if that goes wrong, it's somebody else's responsibility. And he was the one that famously said, if you want to go to the moon, at some point, you've got to try to go to the moon. You've got to take that risk. There's no other way forward. And he said to the group, do you want to go to the moon? They went, yeah. He goes, then we're going to have to press that button and take the risk. And that's a deep understanding of fear, where nowadays, I think, certainly with some of the organizations I've worked with, there's this kind of thing of covering up failure, of not taking risks, of always covering your back and making certain that every single decision, there's all the paperwork behind it and so on. This was a different era.
Yeah, I mean, there's one scene in the book where, I forget who it was, but there were some people that were trying to push the blame away from themselves, and they got fired. And the one guy, he said, yep, I screwed up. That person wound up getting promoted, I guess, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's Jerry Bostic, who went in there and messed up on a simulation. The other two tried to blame each other, essentially, as somebody else. He's the one that stepped forward and went, nah, it's my fault. And they got rid of the other two. They said, you're dangerous in this environment.
Well, look, I mean, this book is a story of triumph, but I guess if you had continued it forward, you would have had to address the Space Shuttle Challenger, for instance. And, this is something that I teach in my classes. I talk about the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. But it does seem like some of the characteristics that you're talking about maybe have, they faded over time.
Yes.
So what exactly, what was the problem? If you dig further into this, what was it that was lost? I mean, it seems like by the time they got to the Space Shuttle Challenger, there was a pressure to perform, a pressure. And you said there was one point in the launch of, I forget which one it was, where the leader said, hey, look, we don't have to go to the moon today, right? And that's what enabled them to feel comfortable pulling the plug if they thought there was something wrong.
Yeah, that's Jerry Griffin. So that was on one of the launches. It was a very, very problematic launch. But yet the management above him didn't pull rank. They still said, this is your decision. This is your call as whether we carry on with this mission or not. All we're saying is we don't need to go to the moon today. So in other words, don't feel any pressure from us to get that kind of what they called go fever, to push on beyond where you're comfortable. So I think there's that difference between taking risks and, quite frankly, taking too many risks. You've got to take some risks, but as soon as you get into the uncomfortable thing, then there's, in this instance, people's lives at stake, then you've got to be the other person who's going to stand up and go, no, this is not going to happen. And I think what was sad was that many of them said one of the reasons we did this was what we thought was, my goodness, if we can put 2 people on the moon and bring them back safely, whatever lessons we've learned from that, we could use to alleviate other issues, homelessness, for example, or whatever. That we could do anything.
Well, no, that's what we always say. Like, if we can put a man on the moon, how come we can't?
Exactly. We can't feed
cure diabetes or whatever,
or whatever it is. And there is some sadness that whatever lessons were learned there weren't carried forward. The program ended, and that was pretty much that. And organizations, I think, have become very conservative in terms of risk taking, which is sort of sad, and in terms of the next generation of students within science, I think we want to encourage people to be expansive thinkers, to have crazy ideas. Obviously, you need to find out whether they're true or not. But again, even within science, I think we're quite conservative. And we want to encourage students to think in a certain way, to do science in a certain way, and so on. And I'm just rather pro the more maverick approach. In some extent, the only students we have are those people that are good at passing exams. And I often think, I wonder what talent is out there that just happen to not be so good at passing exams, that maybe would have had creative, amazing ideas that would have changed the world. And they don't sit in our labs or in our universities because they're not the sort of people that want to sit in a hall and write something on a piece of paper.
Well, I think one of the guys in the book, you said, was actually a fairly not very good student, right? Before he saw JFK's speech and got very excited at Rice University. I mean,
Yeah.
to what extent? I mean, you mentioned most of these people came from humble backgrounds. Does that matter? I mean, it seems like nowadays anybody who's involved in some big project has gone to top tier universities with
Yes.
multiple degrees and so forth. I mean, is there something about coming from this humble background and then getting thrust into this role with major responsibility that
It's a good question. I mean, many of them were the first in their families to go to university. Those that did go to university or college, and often they're from rural backgrounds. And the one thing that gave them was a real appetite for teamwork. In those sorts of environments, you don't really solve anything on your own. You've got to be a good team player. Where sometimes when you take sort of stars from top universities, there's a lot of ego in there. They want to be the person that solves the problem. And when I spoke to all of the mission controllers, they were all telling me how wonderful somebody else was. That it was never about them. It's like, oh, you should speak to so-and-so. They did incredible work on that. So there was this sense of it's a team verse. It's not about ego. It's not about yourself. It's about doing something bigger for other people and doing it as a team. And I think that rather ordinary background, if you want to phrase it like that, is crucial to that versus you're the star. You've got this incredible ability to change the world. It's all going to be about you. And again, nowadays, I look at social media stuff and boy, is it all about the people posting versus, trying to create a better world and trying to make life better for others.
But the characteristics that you describe in these individuals, they seem very similar to the characteristics that we talk about here in Silicon Valley when we're talking about kind of successful founders or, the people who are in these very successful, high growth companies that are doing all sorts of new stuff, right? In particular, it's this combination of a really strong belief that one will ultimately succeed, but with a high comfort level with failure, which seems somewhat contradictory, but it seems like that's the balance that you need to have if you're going to do these great things.
Yeah, I think there's a few other factors in there. So I think there's the ability to work in teams, not wanting to be number one. I think the passion that comes from achieving something for the good of others and the good of the world is going to drive people forward. The ability to think of alternative solutions. I mean, the original, I'm not a space engineer by any means, but the original idea of getting to the moon was build a big rocket, send it to the moon, try and land it, and then try and get it back again. Crazy idea. Until somebody goes, you know what, we should build a rocket that just gets outside the Earth's gravitational pull, then a smaller one goes to the moon, even smaller one comes down. That's quite radical thinking. And actually, originally, NASA was pushed back on that heavily. Yeah. So that's why I'm so pro creativity in science and getting people that think differently, because that's where your good ideas are gonna come from. And sometimes those people are not the ones that perform best in an exam hall. They're the ones that just want to get out there and change the world.
Well, I mean, that story you just mentioned, you talk about this guy, Werner von Braun, who was a real big, significant player and had a lot of power in this organization. He ultimately was convinced that his original idea was the wrong one. Now, that might not have happened if not for the persistence of the guy who's advocating the other idea.
Yeah.
I mean, he kept trying and trying and trying, and sooner or later there was in place a process or a system that enabled the good idea to prevail. But I mean, you could imagine an alternative scenario where this guy just gave up, and this probably would have pushed the whole thing back by a couple of years, right?
Oh, it would have been a complete failure. I mean, we'd have just ended up concluding you can't get to the moon, I think. And I wonder how many other people have had great ideas that could have changed the world and just basically weren't as persistent, or the system didn't allow them to voice those ideas, or didn't have the drive to keep on going, or whatever. We always imagine this is the best of the world, but actually there's probably alternative universes out there somewhere where the world is much, much better because somehow those people were given a voice. And I don't know what it's like in the States, but in the UK, academia is quite conservative. And I, as I said before, I do wish that some of those people that don't do perhaps so well in exams, but still have enormous talents in terms of seeing the world differently and being creative and going, hold on a second, being that voice in the room that goes, this sounds like a bit of a weird idea, but how about? And then I sit in loads of creativity meetings, ad agencies or whatever. And there's always that voice, that person around the table, when 10 of you think one thing, and it's that person, that number 11, who goes, you know what? And then they come out with a sentence that changes the whole thing on its head, and we all go, oh, why didn't we see it? I think nurturing those voices within science would be a very helpful thing to do.
Yeah, when I talk to my colleagues, I mean, they often bemoan the lack of creativity in their PhD students, right?
Right.
But then, they're not going to change the criteria for admission anytime soon. But I think there's an outlet valve, at least here in Silicon Valley, where if you are not someone who's going to get ahead in academia, I mean, you have all sorts of places that you can go to do your thing, right? So the private sector is a place, at least, maybe not in the large mature companies, but you can get funding for your crazy idea. I just had a podcast interview with a seed stage investor, very well-known seed stage investor for my podcast. And, he said, we're always looking for those people. They're constantly on the lookout for the people who have these crazy ideas, who can see things that no one else can see. So I think one big difference is the large corporations versus the kind of marketplace for startups. But there was no larger organization than NASA at the time.
Yes.
So that to me is what is astonishing, is how, and not only that, but it's a governmental institution.
Yes.
Which is so large, governmental, right? It had everything stacked against it, and yet still it was this place where the good ideas could bubble up to the top.
And I'm assuming, I'm not an expert on this, I'm assuming part of that was JFK, who just sort of had this vision and said, make it happen. Then Chris Kraft has to come in and actually make it happen. And he's the one with the sorts of vision that we're talking about here. With PhD students, I always say to my PhD students, I don't have any more, but when I have in the past, go into a school and explain your area to a group of 8-year-old kids and ask them what you should do next. Because they will be the ones that will come up with the crazy ideas and listen to them, because somewhere in there is the voice of something you've never thought of. And we all like to think we're right, and that the way we think is the right way to think, and there's only one way of looking at the world. And I think we should be celebrating, hey, I've got it all wrong. There's this other way of looking at things. It's really hard to be open like that within academia. I'm sure within certain aspects of the private sector that is more valued, but within academia, not quite so much.
Well, I mean, you offer up a whole bunch of wonderful exercises. In almost all your books, you have these little exercises, right, where you ask somebody to do something and spend a few minutes doing it. And I'm sure that a lot of people just kind of blast through and don't actually do these things. But, these things are incredibly useful to kind of assess and gauge the extent to which you are thinking creatively or, thinking coherently. And you can very quickly get an insight from one of these exercises that you wouldn't get necessarily from, reading a study or reading a book. And that, I think when it comes to teaching, if you can teach in that way, where you have people do these exercises, it's very, very helpful, more so than, say, a lecture.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, lectures are terrible, terrible ideas. I mean, in that trying to hold, I'm a performer. My background's in magic. Now I'm at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. So, I know how long an hour can feel when I go and see a bad show. The idea of standing in front of a group of people and engaging them for an hour with just, a few PowerPoint slides or whatever it is, a whiteboard or whatever it is, that's crazy. I mean, it's really, really, really hard. And normally students are actually quite bored by the professor standing there, often because they don't bring in humanity, they don't bring in stories, they don't tell you who it was who created certain things and why they created them, or anything about those people's lives. So I just think there's a lot to be learned from performance in order to hold students' attention. And really in that hour, in that lecture, what you can do, that I think is of greatest value, is to motivate the student to go and read more outside of the lecture, and rather than trying to use it to deliver information. And so I always say to my students, put down it used to be pieces of paper, now it's tablets and computers. I want to see eyeballs, and I want you to engage. So one thing, it's not always the most popular thing, which is instead of asking me a question at the end, who's got a question, I say, I want you all to think of a question, and I'll randomly choose some people. Now that people, oh my goodness, now I've got to think of a question, and then I just randomly choose people, and that becomes more interesting for everyone because it forces them to engage. Telling them that they're now going to break into small groups and it's their job to teach the next class suddenly engages them as well. So I think there's all these things we can learn from performers. But the most interesting thing about people is other people. So where ideas come from, who were these great scientists? What were their lives like? All that stuff will help create a magnetic lecture, I think.
Well, I mean, I think it was Abraham Lincoln who said, if you give me 10 minutes to, cut down a tree, I'll spend 9 minutes sharpening my axe.
Yes.
Do you think that we, as whether it's academics or practitioners, do we need to spend more time kind of practicing our mental muscles? I mean, you point out that sometimes if you got to, to go to the moon, you got to sometimes go to the moon, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, should we be working out our brains? Should we be stress testing our views of the world? Should we be doing things that are sort of on the, support side instead of spending all our time kind of doing stuff?
I don't know. I certainly think that in terms of lecturing, we could be doing a lot more to create engaging talks and learning from performance. I think that's definitely the case. I would say in my own field, my own specialism is psychology of the paranormal. Now, I know loads of people who believe really weird, strange things. They believe in the afterlife. They believe that you can communicate with the dead. They believe in ghosts. They believe in all sorts of entanglement, quantum telepathy things that I don't fully understand. Now, I think early on, I was incredibly dismissive. I just thought, you know what, you're all a bit strange. Now, it's not that I believe what they say, because I don't. I'm deeply skeptical. But I do think there might be something in there. There might be something to what you're saying. It's maybe not what you think it is. So, and time and again, I found that rather eccentric thinking has paid off. So a very good friend of mine, Tony Cornell, no longer with us, unfortunately. Tony believed in ghosts. So he thinks, I wonder how reliable people's testimony is for ghosts. But the problem is that you can't just look at a piece of ghost testimony and find out whether it's reliable, because you don't know what the actual ghost was like.
Yeah, so you don't have the ground truth. You
don't know the ground truth.
Yeah.
So Tony, being Tony, decides, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to dress up as a ghost. And I'm going to run around Cambridge. He was based in Cambridge. I'll run around Cambridge. And then we know what the ground truth is. So then when we've got people's testimony, we can find out how accurate they are. So that's what he does. He runs around Cambridge dressed as a ghost with a big white sheet. He is gutted because no one notices him. So now he goes to a local cinema, film house, and as the film is playing, he puts on his sheet and he walks across in front of the film. Then he interviews everyone about the ghost experience, and no one notices him. So he's absolutely gutted. His experiment has failed because he hasn't got any testimony about what ghosts are like. And he did that in 1957, 1958. It turns out he stumbled on a fundamental aspect of human perception, which we now refer to as inattentional blindness, which is that when you focus your attention in one place, you're essentially blind, even to the most unexpected events outside of it. very famous video involving a basketball, which celebrates that. So it'd been easy to look back on Tony and go, oh, you're eccentric and a strange belief in ghosts. But you know what? He stumbled on something absolutely fundamental, probably 20, 30 years before perceptual psychologists did. So I just think the openness is now key to going, it's not that I believe this crazy idea or whatever it is, but maybe there's something to listen to. There's something to learn here. And that's the openness that I'm talking about.
So anything is worth studying to some degree, right?
Yeah, it depends how you study it. Yes.
Right. And it seems like the more unusual or puzzling or perplexing it is, perhaps the more worthy it is of some study.
Yeah. And it's not like it's not a dichotomy. When someone's got a very weird idea, and I'm sure it happens in physics and mathematics where people have theories about the universe or whatever, it's not like it has to be true or it has to be fake or false. Maybe there's some middle ground. We think, okay, it's not what you think, but there's something in there. You've noticed an anomaly. You've noticed something which is of value. So I think part of it is saying to students and academics, what doesn't fit in with your theories? You know, what does not, what do you not predict? Because we don't like that. That's that stuff again of like, well, we like all our theories to be true. And we're comfortable when we see evidence that supports it. Well, go and find the evidence that doesn't support your theory, because that's where the good stuff will be.
Now, you've also been a practicing magician, is that right?
For many years. Yeah.
And so what has that taught you about psychology?
Taught me a lot. I mean, there's basically the perceptual side of it. Magicians are often doing things at place A and you're not looking at place B, and that's where the hidden stuff is. It's also taught me that people love mystery, and that's key to science as well. In terms of magic, when I look back, I got into magic when I was 8 years old via a grandfather who showed me an incredible magic trick. Most of my friends are magicians. It's an incredible community. We all know each other and share ideas, very creative community. I can't imagine my life without magic. It's helped me in terms of social skills. You go to a party, you've got something to do, a little trick to do. You have to learn what to do when tricks go wrong, because believe me, they do all of the time. Magicians are very creative, as I say, and they create new ideas and presentations all the time. So my latest book, which isn't out in the States at the moment, is Magic Your Mind Happy, which is a kids' magic book, but you're learning all of these important life skills, creativity and optimism and so on, through learning magic tricks. And that came out a few months ago. So yeah, magic is incredibly important. And it shows you fundamentally that you can be very, very confident and very, very wrong. You know, when a magician shows you an empty box and makes something appear in it, that audience have to be 100% certain that there's nothing in that box, and they are 100% wrong because an object's going to appear in that box. So it should teach us a bit of humility as well.
Yeah. So does practicing deception make you better at recognizing deception, and maybe even better at recognizing self-deception?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it makes you better at solving magic tricks and creating them. I don't think it extends much beyond that. Except you start to question assumptions. I always say magicians are the only people that see 3 legs on a chair and think, maybe there isn't a 4th one. Because that's how they work. Their minds work like that. Tricks work because we're so good. You know, we think, well, we don't put a person on the moon and we come up with vaccines and incredible inventions. That's because we've made assumptions a lot of the time. We've made little leaps. You wouldn't get out of bed in the morning unless you made assumptions about the floor being solid and how the day's going to go. And magic creeps in and just points out those assumptions are wrong some of the time. 99.9% of the time they're correct. But in magic and optical illusions, we exploit that. But we wouldn't be as amazing as we are without those assumptions.
Well, Richard, thanks so much for joining me. This latest book, forgetting about the magic book, is this one,
Yes.
Shoot for the Moon, How the Moon Landings Taught Us the 8 Secrets of Success. And it's amazing that this is, 50, 60 years after the events in question, and there's still so much that you can learn from those experiences. It's incredible. The other book is called...
It is amazing. And it just shows, that speaks as testimony to what it is that they achieved.
Then we also got 59 Seconds. This is one I recommend to everybody. They should definitely check it out. And you can eat it, you can consume it in small bites. You don't have to do it again. And we've got Quirkology, As If Principle. We even talk about 101 Bets You'll Always Win and The Luck Factor. Thanks so much.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.